חלילי חליל אל החולות של המדבר היה שולח, ליטפו את גופה הרך והסופה טרפה הכל, חדל להיות כמו החולות, אני רוצה אותך.
Hey everybody, Drew here. This week outside of the Jewish synagogue that's right down the street from our church. It's a beautiful campus and a part of a beautiful religion that I've always been really interested and love studying, and I thought for this week's lesson this would be the most appropriate place to be. That's another thing I love about living in this neighborhood is there's so many churches, so many forms of faith in such a close proximity to one another. So yeah, I'm just right down the street from Good Shepherd, over here at the synagogue, and today we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. If you remember last week, of course, we talked about what it means to love God through worship and through our lifestyle and stuff like that, because we're starting off this year discussing what does it mean to be a Christian and what's the point of all this. And so if you remember, somebody asked Jesus, what's the most important thing in life? And Jesus says, well, it's love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so we talked about loving God last week, and I want to talk about loving our neighbors this week. This is always funny to me because there's still like a lot of debate. I still hear people talk about what it means to love your neighbor, or who our neighbors are. But Jesus answers that question immediately in Luke 10. We got last 2 weeks we've been talking about Luke 10, and when someone says, what's the most important thing in life? And he says, love God and love your neighbor. But then right away in the same passage in Luke 10, someone says, well, Jesus, who's my neighbor? And he doesn't give them a specific description, or it's people from these regions, or it's someone that lives in your town, or someone that's a part of your same religion or anything. He could have been specific and said that's just everybody, but he didn't even do that. He described who our neighbors are, but he did it in an unbelievably tricky and careful and like mind-blowing way. So someone says, well, Jesus, who's my neighbor then? And Jesus says, well, it's kind of like this. And then he tells a story. And the story Jesus tells is about a man who was basically robbed and mugged. Something else that I'm sensitive to, I've actually seen people on 2 occasions be mugged right across the street from church here on Morse Avenue. It's not pretty. So this man is robbed and beaten, and he's laying on the side of the road. And Jesus says, well, it's kind of like this. This man is laying on the side of the road, and a priest walks by and just passes him on the other side of the road, just doesn't give him the time of day. And then he says a Levite walks by after that, passes by on the other side of the road, and doesn't give him the time of day. And then Jesus describes someone who does stop and help the man. But what we need to understand is it's 2015 in California. We're Lutherans, we don't really get a lot of the biblical language sometimes. And so Jesus, it's important that he first says a priest and then a Levite. When Jesus says a priest, he's talking, of course, about his own religion and the religion of the people that he's speaking to. So a priest is a Jewish religious leader. He's kind of like our equivalent of a pastor or a religious leader. So someone who's supposed to be setting the example, teaching believers what it means to be a good Jew, and he says that person just walks right by. It'd be like if today Jesus said, a pastor walks by, or a Lutheran bishop walks by, and just ignores this bleeding, almost dead guy on the side of the road. He just walks right by, kind of calling attention to, the people that should be helping the most, the people that are probably we would expect to help the most, the people that are supposed to be compassionate and godly. He says he just walks right by. And then he says a Levite walks by and passes on the other side of the road. And this is where it's really interesting, because the Levites are a very special group of people in the Old Testament and even in Jesus' time. The Levites are descendants of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're given basically all of the religious leadership duties. So all priests are Levites. So if you come from the tribe of Levi, not all Levites are priests, but all priests have to be from the tribe of Levi. So he's saying that a priest walks by. And then he says, furthermore, a Levite walks by, which is basically like saying, one of the people from this group of set apart, sort of special religious people. I mean, the Levites were given special religious duties. And so he's kind of picking on an individual kind of person. Like, so it's not an exact comparison, but if maybe I were to tell you this story in our terms, I could say, I would say, yeah, a guy's lying dead on the side of the road, and then a pastor walks by and just ignores him. And then if I'm trying to like really narrow it in to like our context, I would say, a bunch of Lutheran pastors walk by, or a bunch of Christian, pastors walk by. He's kind of picking on one particular kind of person, a religious leader, and then a group of people that are supposed to be kind of like special, religious, kind of holy, set apart, a group of people. So Jesus is kind of highlighting like, the people that we have the highest expectations on to be good people, to help others, to love and be generous. And Jesus just blows their mind by saying, yeah, this person walks by, doesn't do anything. And then this person walks by, doesn't do anything. And then he says, a Samaritan walks by. And then he tells the story of how the Samaritan, brings the man home and nurses him back to health, essentially, heals his wounds, gives him something to eat and a place to stay and a place to rest. And, to us, again, this doesn't really mean anything, because most of us don't know what a Samaritan is, or how that applies in the story, or what that means for us in 2015 in Sacramento. But Jesus says, basically, he's telling his audience, one of you walks by, one of your kind. It'd be like saying, a couple Christians go by and just ignore the person. But then Jesus blows their minds and flips the story by saying a Samaritan ends up being the one that's helping this guy. Now, in the first century, it's been this way for a while, but particularly at the time Jesus is telling the story, Samaritans they don't get along with the Jews very well. They're not friends per se. Samaritans are like a new racial, ethnic, religious class that have emerged from the time that the Jews were in captivity, when they were taken captive to Babylon, and then under Persia, and they are Jews that are not in the first century. To Jews at that time, they weren't like whole, pure Jews. If you're a Harry Potter fan, which I am, basically, and if you're not a Harry Potter fan, this will mean nothing to you. But if you're a Harry Potter fan, in the first century, a Samaritan would have been like a mudblood, someone who was only like half a wizard. We're getting off track, I'm sorry. But they were an ethnic class that they were Jewish in a lot of ways, but they weren't pure Jews. They were Jews that had married and had kids and had family outside of completely Jewish families. And they worshiped in some different places in some different ways, and so it's hard to explain. We don't have time to get into it now, but basically the Jews thought much less of them. And the Samaritans thought a lot less of the Jews. In fact, the Jews oppressed the Samaritans quite a bit, and the Samaritans did some things back to the Jews that weren't very cool either. And so you have this like religious kind of battle, this racial and ethnic battle, and the Samaritans were hated by the Jews at this point in time, like hated. There's another story in the Gospels where Jesus is talking to this woman. It's the woman at the well, if that sounds familiar. And there's one part of the story where the woman goes, "Why are you even talking to me? I'm a Samaritan." Like insinuating that Jesus shouldn't even been seen around her. That's how much the Jews looked down upon these people at this point in time. And so, try to think of that when you're hearing this story, when we read Luke 10, and Jesus said, "Well, who's my neighbor?" And someone says to Jesus, "Who's my neighbor?" And Jesus says, "Well, it's kind of like this. This guy's dying on the side of the road. He needs someone's help. And a religious leader walks by, doesn't do anything." Kind of a special, set-apart religious person, from your religion, by the way. Jesus, the people that he's talking to, this is really hitting home with him, because he's saying, yeah, one of like your people, they just ignore him. But then this person, this Samaritan, and then Jesus goes on and tells a story about how the Samaritan, doesn't just like make sure he's not dead. The Samaritan takes the man in, and nurses him back to health. And then at the end of the story, this is the crazy part. At the end of the story, Jesus says, now go and do likewise. In other words, he says, go and be like the Samaritan. So Jesus is telling a Jew to go and be like a Samaritan. He's telling this person who is a part of the chosen nation, talking about religious leaders, the elite in this chosen nation, to go and be like these people you despise and that you look down upon and that you oppress. Now, obviously the point of the story is not necessarily that Samaritans are better than Jews. Of course not. The point of the story is, one, our neighbors are anyone and everyone. And oftentimes, they're people that maybe we look down on. Even if it's like subconsciously, even if we don't really mean to, or even if maybe we know we do but we feel bad about it. Oftentimes that the people we look down on, people that we think are different than us, people that are different than us because they're a different religion, or they speak a different language, or they're a different race, or whatever the case is. Jesus uses this powerful story to talk about these two classes that are dramatically different, that do not like each other very much. And he kind of flips the story by making the person that does the right thing, making the good person that does what's right in Jesus' eyes, kind of like the enemy. We would call it, in movies you would say the antagonist kind of becomes the protagonist, or the villain becomes the hero in this story. And so Jesus is saying, it's not always the people that you think that should do right are the ones that are doing right. And quite frankly, anyone is capable, no matter what you think of them, anyone is capable of doing something that is right and holy and good in God's eyes. And how Jesus frames that is by being there for someone, by helping someone. And so, I have to imagine that the audience listening to this story in its original context isn't liking what they hear very much the first time around. But Jesus is saying, no, you know what? It's not just you. It's not just people like you that can do the right thing. But anybody can do the right thing, which is helping everyone. So who is your neighbor? Remember, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And who is our neighbor? It is anyone. It is everyone, despite how they look, despite how they sound, how they speak, or what religion they are. We have a duty and a calling and a purpose to share love, to share the love of God, and to show compassion, and to be selfless with everyone we encounter.